like your music.
Thank you. Well, good morning to you, Kingdom people. We're excited to be here. Welcome to Insight. Amen. It's a great, great day in the kingdom of God, and we're excited to be here. Welcome, welcome, one and all. Amen. Amen. Welcome, YouTube. Welcome, Facebook. Welcome, people around the globe. Welcome to you. Insight, meaning that each and every time we get on this platform, whether it's YouTube or whether it's Facebook, our goal is to inspire, equip, and encourage you. And that's what we're going to be doing this morning with Dr. Pamela Phillips. Amen. Amen. We'll give her a great big applause. I like doing my applause button.
I'll take it.
We're taking everything we can get this morning. Well, Dr. Phillips, welcome to you. And we're very excited to have you this morning. Our people are coming on slowly but surely. They are coming on, and we are very excited to see you and to hear about Juneteenth, the importance of Juneteenth. Amen. And some of you may not be familiar with Dr. Phillips, so let me share a bit of her bio with you. Amen. Dr. Pamela Phillips has worked in education for several years as an administrator, and most recently an associate professor teaching history and African American studies. Dr. Phillips has also served as the intern director of the James and Janie Washington Foundation. She has 3 decades of experience, 3 decades of experience researching African American families, and has successfully located birth parents for clients as well. And to me, that was one of the things that, wow, that was really interesting to me. So I hope maybe you can share a bit of some of your research with that. And lastly, she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, a Master of Arts in History, Master of Science in Counseling, and a doctorate in education. So we know that she's well equipped. Amen. She has served on the boards of the Black Heritage Society of Washington State and the National Council of Negro Women. Amen. That's an extensive background, and we really appreciate your time, Dr. Phillips, for being here. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So one of the things that I want to ask, what is Juneteenth? What is Juneteenth?
Well, Juneteenth is a commemoration, and for most of your viewers, they're probably at home today because of this commemoration, which became a federal holiday. It is the day, June 19th, 1865. And the original date was the day that the U.S. military arrived in Galveston, Texas to facilitate the emancipation of the enslaved Africans who lived there. And I'm using the term enslaved Africans because the 13th Amendment preceded the 14th Amendment, which made the Africans living in the United States African Americans. And some people generically use the term African Americans to describe the people who lived in America who came from Africa, from the point of being brought as indentured servants or being brought as enslaved individuals, but they weren't considered Americans until after the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed the rights to citizenship. And so when I teach, I make that clear distinction. And as I talk a little bit about, the events that sort of led up to Juneteenth and beyond, you'll see what I mean in terms of people not really having a status in the United States or even in the colonial period. So basically, this is an event, a federal holiday that just recognizes the fact that Africans had once been enslaved and received their freedom. And so you could say that to some degree, there are two parts to it. The original date where people were finally given their freedom by the military showing up in Galveston. But there's the other part of it which is about people finally acknowledging that Africans lived as enslaved individuals for centuries in the United States and also in the colonial era. Throughout the United States, throughout North America, South America, and the Caribbean, Africans were enslaved.
Wow, that's really interesting. One of the things that I was reading just a little bit about it is that Texas, am I correct? Texas was the last to get the information. Why was that?
Well, the official explanation is simply that they had to get the military personnel there. It wasn't only because they needed to get the information, they needed the military to back up. One of the things that happened immediately after the 13th Amendment was ratified was they established the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a group of administrators who took care of things like setting up contracts between African Americans and their former enslavers, also setting up schools, hospital facilities, and basically intervening when African Americans needed assistance dealing with, people in their communities. But they needed support from the military. I would say that it took a war to end slavery. So the people weren't going down easy. But one of the things I would like to say is it's important to celebrate Juneteenth as the day when Africans in America finally got their freedom. But it's also important to explore the history of the African freedom seekers that is rarely discussed because, the efforts to end slavery in America started long before Juneteenth. They started in the colonial era. And something I also want to say is that emancipation took place in many different ways. So I want to make a distinction between terms for you. Okay, and the first term I want to define for you is emancipation, which is the formal release of enslaved people through government action or law. Okay, so this could be a change in a state constitution. This could be a court case. There is also self-emancipation, when people decide that they're just not going to allow themselves to, or don't want to live under slavery anymore, and so they decide to walk away. And I do have a specific example of that. And then there's also manumission, which is a process in which an enslaver voluntarily freed an enslaved person. And it really, for example, Thomas Jefferson released some of Sally Hemings' children, not all of them. Her last two sons stayed in Virginia, but Beverly and his daughter, or I said Beverly and her daughter, her son Beverly and her daughter were, manumitted. And the daughter kind of disappeared into the DC area. There is one drawing of her, but just no record of where she went, or, but she was released voluntarily by Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
So there was gradual emancipation that took place. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to give you some examples of the timeline.
Please do.
So in 1777, Vermont, the independent Vermont Republic just basically decided that they were going to create a state constitution prohibiting slavery. So that's what I meant by sometimes states could create their constitutions.
Okay.
On the other hand, in 1780, Pennsylvania adopted a gradual emancipation statute. So basically what that means is that people were not just released immediately. Sometimes they were required to have some sort of apprenticeship, or they had to wait until people reached maturity, which could be the age of 18. So the gradual process really depended on the state statutes. 1783 banned slavery outright, but there was a legal process to get to it, which I'm going to discuss after I finish giving you this timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And they banned slavery outright through their judicial decree. The people who were petitioning and suing against slavery in Massachusetts were basing their court cases on the 1780 Constitution of Massachusetts. New Hampshire was also in 1783 with a gradual emancipation. Connecticut and Rhode Island had gradual emancipation. New York was very interesting. I was doing some research on Sojourner Truth for another project, and what I discovered was just how active New Yorkers were in slavery, unlike a lot of northern states. And so New York was actually one of the last states to end slavery. Their emancipation law was enacted in 1799, but all the people were not emancipated until 1827. So they're kind of late in the game. New Jersey was 1804. And then lastly, New Hampshire, 1787, which I found to be an interesting case, because New Hampshire, being a northern state, was less likely to use slavery to boost their economies. And so I want to go back to self-emancipation. I mentioned that earlier. And sometimes that took place through military service. And sometimes that took place through court cases. You all are probably familiar with the Underground Railroad. And then some people walk away. And I want to give you an example of a woman who walked away, who I'm sure you all will recognize when I talk about her name. Isabella Baumfried. Does anyone recognize her name?
I've never heard of Isabella. I'm writing her name.
You have heard of her. She's also known as Sojourner Truth.
Ah.
Okay, so she walked away from slavery in the early 1800s, but not only did she walk away, but she came back to get her son. And her son was illegally sold into the Deep South. And so she and her friends actually helped her to petition the court. And the Supreme Court Commissioner declared that the child was to be delivered back to his mother's custody. And so she was able to retrieve Peter. And if you're interested in seeing those documents, they are available through the New York Public Library and also the Schomburg Center there. And so, interestingly enough, Solomon Gedney, who was the man who had sold her son, was prosecuted for kidnapping to force Peter's return.
Wow.
Some other things, some other ways, as I mentioned before, court cases. There were a few court cases that I personally can recall that were instrumental in ending slavery in Massachusetts. The first was Mum Bet, who was also known as Elizabeth Freeman. And she was a woman who sued for her freedom in 1781. And Quock Walker involved more than one case. And he also sued for his freedom as well. There was a gentleman named Prince Hall. Prince Hall and Primus Hall lived in Massachusetts, father and son, and they were remarkable men. If you're interested in seeing the documents, their petitions, you can go to the Massachusetts Online Archive and look up Prince Hall petition to the Massachusetts legislature. And so he filled out a petition. And basically what they were calling for was for, well, first of all, he called for Africans to be able to participate in the American Revolution. But secondly, he also sent a petition to the Massachusetts legislature calling for abolition and equal rights for Africans who were living in Massachusetts. I think that one of the things that's really unclear to people living in America is the fact that there were a lot of people who were enslaved in the South. We all know that to be a fact. Right. But there were a lot of people, not as many, but a lot of people were living free in the North. They had been previously enslaved, or they were the children of people who had been manumitted. Some of them may have been descendants of people who had been indentured servants, but there were free Northerners. And these Northerners were working to make sure that their brethren would get freedom. There was also a situation where people began to gain their freedom. African men began to gain their freedom through involvement in the military. So during the American Revolution, Lord Dunsmore was a British officer who offered freedom to any enslaved African who chose to become a loyalist and support the British forces. And some of those people who chose to support were taken to Canada, which was also part of Great Britain at that time. And so this also happened in 1812, where there was a group of people who lived near Virginia who were offered freedom, and they were put on ships and taken to Nova Scotia. And so some of the relatives of my husband's family actually have folks who were part of that group who were taken to Nova Scotia. Wow. And so you can actually go to Nova Scotia and see a pretty sizable Afro-Canadian population, I guess would be the appropriate term. And so you saw that happening in the Revolutionary War in the 1770s, and you saw it happening in the War of 1812. And of course, we all know that Africans chose to leave the plantations after the Emancipation Proclamation. And I have this under the military section because the Emancipation Proclamation did two things. It basically said that those people who were enslaved in the Confederate states, not the Union states. Okay, there were still a few Union slave states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Delaware.
We were still kind of divided.
Well, those states still had slavery, but they were part of the Union. But those Confederate states in the South were being told that they were that the people were free who had been enslaved. Now, those people who lived in the South did not represent or recognize President Lincoln. They recognized Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. But just the same, the Africans who heard about it, they didn't recognize Jefferson Davis. They chose to recognize Lincoln, and they began to migrate to find the U.S. troops so that they could stay behind those lines and have their safety. They were considered contraband. And as such, they were seized by the U.S. troops and
So,
protected from
doctor,
being recaptured.
so you're saying that the people were actually considered as contraband?
Yes, because according to U.S. policy, slavery had been banned
Yes.
in the southern states. And so those people who were being held as slaves were considered contraband when they made their way. That was the legal way of getting them behind the Union lines
Okay.
and a legal way of keeping them, kind of circumventing some of the earlier policies. I
Okay.
want to, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I do want to talk about, and I will be coming back to this issue
You're doing
of the
fine.
1860s. But there are a lot of people who think that Africans were just very, very passive and just sat there, wringing their hands miserably in slavery. And we all know of Haiti and how the Haitians fought to gain their freedom. But the Africans in America were also doing it as well. In 1712, before the United States became a thing, there was a revolt in New York.
Yeah.
Denmark Vesey, I'm sure that some of you have heard of him, was a free African who was trying to create a rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. And then I forgot there was also the Stonewall Rebellion. And then we also know of Nat Turner, who was an enslaved African preacher who led a major rebellion in Virginia in 1831. And then, of course, John Brown, many of you are familiar with John Brown. He was a white preacher, but he also recruited Africans to fight with him at Harper's Ferry as well. And so I just really want to show that sometimes the resistance was through joining the military. Sometimes the resistance was filing a petition or a court case. And sometimes the resistance was actual violence as people began to, push for their freedom. Around the time of John Brown, a couple of things happened that were threats to the freedom of Africans in the North. And one of them was the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act basically was a federal law that required the return of any freedom seekers who had escaped from the South and had made their way to the North. And so people were legally obligated to return these folks to the South. But there was another part to it because they also sort of gave a little bit of a reward to people who would turn in a freedom seeker, which was perilous for people because anyone could say that their neighbor was a freedom seeker. And so the other thing that happened in the 1850s, which was very detrimental to people living in the North, or Africans living in the North, was the Supreme Court case, the ruling Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott had gone into a free state. He went back to a slave state and he sued for his freedom because he was taken to a slave state, but the court ruled against him. And basically, this particular case declared that Africans were not citizens and therefore they could not sue for their freedom. Okay. And that Congress could not prevent slavery in federal territory. So this was a big step backwards for Africans who were living in the North. And so this is the period of time where people are starting to get more radicalized because, after the Fugitive Slave Act, the stakes were higher. And this occurred in a couple of ways. First of all, I want to talk about the Underground Railroad, which I'm sure most of your listeners have heard about.
Oh, yes.
And some of the proponents of the Underground Railroad, just to give a basic definition of the Underground Railroad, it was a network of people who were sympathetic to those who were enslaved, who opened their homes and protected and fed people who were enslaved. And it was also a network of administrators who sort of helped to organize and facilitate it. It's a very secretive thing. I'm sure that you have heard of one person who was a major proponent of the Underground Railroad, and that is Harriet Tubman, who herself had been enslaved, and she was instrumental in helping many people get their freedom. But one individual who is not as common, but if you're interested in learning more about him, you can find his documentary on PBS, and that is William Still. And I
William
do have
Still?
William Still, and I have his book, but I didn't bring it down with me. I just happened to have it, took it to work the other day, and I didn't bring it down with me. But William Still was a Philadelphia abolitionist. He was a clerk for the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. He later became the chair of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. And one of the things he did that was remarkable was he actually had a hidden collection of the material where he chronicled the names of the people who were basically made their way through the Philadelphia to get to Canada, basically. And I personally have a stake in this because one of the names of one of the gentlemen is Jefferson Pipkin and his wife, Louisa Pipkin. And we recently made a trip to Canada to try to find out some more information about them because I'm a Pipkin descendant. So I'm not sure if he is related by blood, but I believe his enslaver was the same enslaver of my family as well. So I've been researching that particular group. So I started researching the folks in Canada, and then I started my folks years ago, and then I researched the people of Canada who escaped and worked their way back to who their enslaver was, and it turned out to be the same man I've been researching for years. I've just been looking for the documentation on my family's connection to this particular slaveholder. Anyway, so the point that I'm making is William Still's book is available. You can either find it through Internet Archives, free. I would say you could probably find it through UNC.South, which is University of North Carolina repository of numerous narratives and autobiographies. I mean, it's just a great resource. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Booker T. Washington, William Still, you can find all sorts of narratives there for free. Internet Archives is great, but you have to check it out and you have limited use. If you were to go to the UNC.South, you would actually be able to just use that at will and you don't have to check anything out. It's pretty good. Let's see, Levi Coffin was a Quaker abolitionist, and then also Thomas Garrett was also a Delaware abolitionist. And so when I'm talking about the abolitionists, these are the men and women who are making the efforts to abolish slavery. And so the well-known one I spoke of earlier was Sojourner Truth. Right. David Walker was one of the major abolitionists, and he published Walker's Appeal for Colored Citizens of the World. And he published this in 1829. And he had a more radical stance on abolition. He condemned slavery and called on Americans to recognize the humanities and the human rights of Africans living in America. He died mysteriously. I think he may have died in the 1830s, but I can't remember specifically what date. But his pamphlet is available. Any of these documents, you can go to the National Archives Teaching with Documents section and find it. You can go to Library of Congress and look up Walker's Appeal. You can just go to Google Scholar and look up Walker's Appeal and find this information. And again, it's called Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And since I'm talking about major abolitionists, I'm just going to get onto the role of newspapers. Again, a lot of people don't realize that the Africans who lived in the North had been living there for at least 2, maybe even 3 generations. And they had established, businesses. They had established schools in their communities. For example, one of my favorite people who is also an abolitionist is Robert Purvis, who, even though it's just kind of off topic, when the Africans were not allowed to visit the library in Philadelphia, the city of love, he started the library company for colored people of Philadelphia. So people were establishing their own business. And he actually married Charlotte Fortin, who was the daughter of a very wealthy sailmaker. But that's another discussion. But I'm saying this because I want people to understand that the people who lived in the North, they were affected by slavery indirectly. They were affected by racism and discrimination indirectly, but they lived normal lives, just as you and I live normal lives. So, Reverend Johnson, you know that discrimination exists, but it doesn't sit at the forefront of your mind.
No.
Am I correct? Yes.
Right.
You see it when it happens, but it's not the thing that drives your life. You deal with it if you encounter it. You know, you may speak on it if the discussion comes up, but it's the forefront of your life is your life. And so I want you to understand, you and the viewers, that people were running their businesses, and one of the businesses that people ran were newspapers. And I'm going to speak specifically on one person, actually two people who were actually, I should probably start with three, and that is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass had 3 newspapers. Okay, and I think most people have heard of the North Star, which he started publishing in 1847. He then later published Frederick Douglass's papers and then the Douglass Monthly. Okay, and there is another gentleman, I believe Martin Delany was from Virginia, and he and his mother were forced out of there because she was a free woman and they didn't like that. And so she took her son to another state. And I think it was Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. But he worked closely with Douglass as a writer and a co-editor during the early years of the North Star. And, you know, they kind of went in different directions, I have to say. You know, it was a very difficult time. For example, Frederick Douglass had once worked with William Lloyd Garrison, who published The Liberator, which was another abolitionist newspaper. But Frederick Douglass really wanted to go in different directions. So he has this relationship where he's also publishing with Martin Delany. And they just kind of went in 2 different directions because they had different ideas as the path to freedom for people, Africans who were enslaved. But the bottom line is that they were all fighting to end slavery.
Right.
The last individual I want to talk about, and he has really nothing to do with the newspaper, but he does have something to do with Frederick Douglass, is John Brown. And John Brown, I mentioned earlier, as an individual who in the 1850s became very radicalized, and he was responsible for recruiting people to basically take over the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He lost, and he was executed. The other people were executed as well. But Frederick Douglass, I would say, was probably impacted by his, I wouldn't call it friendship, but just his relationship that he had with John Brown, because John Brown is, if you look at William Lloyd Garrison, who's probably more on the pacifist side, and then John Brown, who is, you know, promoting what is the word? Violence. You couldn't help but be influenced by the opinions of both of these men. But Frederick Douglass did not follow John Brown. He chose to go in a different direction. But after the raid, the authorities suspected Douglass of being involved in the raid. And so he had to make his way to Canada, and later he visited Britain. And which brings us back, since we're back to the 1860s, I mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln's order that declared freedom for enslaved people in the Confederate States. The second part of the Emancipation Proclamation was the formal establishment of the U.S. colored troops. So African men, even African women, had been involved with the U.S. troops, basically providing work, shoveling, carrying bodies of people who were deceased, cooking, you know, maintaining campfires, nursing. You probably have heard stories of Harriet Tubman even being a spy. I'm not sure about, I don't have any facts to substantiate that, but I've heard that as well. And um, but the Emancipation Proclamation formalized the status of African men in the military. So it established a section of the military for African men, and it was called the U.S. Colored Troops. And if you know of anyone in your family who has been involved with the U.S. Colored Troops, I believe I found. I was doing some research for my brother, and I believe I was able to find a database in the National Archives website. So it'd be like nationalarchives.gov. And because he was looking for a gentleman who was involved in the military who had been a Buffalo soldier. And I was able to find his information through the National Archives. So there are databases there. There are also databases for people who are looking for Confederates as well. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation, I think that I really need to make it clear that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free Africans who were enslaved in Union states. It only applied to Africans who were enslaved in Southern states, but the Southern population did not recognize Lincoln. So it did create a lot of confusion. It really disrupted plantations as Africans began to walk away. And so it was very effective because it disrupted the plantations. It was very effective at disrupting their economy. Their economy was already, under stress because they were trying to fight a war. They were trying to fight a war, but they had an economy that was an agricultural economy, and with men being away at war, with Africans running away, or getting behind Union lines and so on and so forth. Financially, they were suffering. The only thing that I really think helped, and I'm sure people might dispute this, but the Confederates is the fact that they were fighting a defensive war. They did not have to worry about marching across the country to fight the war. However, when they decided to march north and to fight a battle, that's when it sort of turned around for the for the Northerners, and they began to, win a few more battles. There's something else I want to say about the Northern economy. It was more diverse. They had banking, they had, fishing, they had lumber, insurance companies. They had a constant supply of Irish men coming in to the United States because of the situation going on in starvation and plague going on. Not plague, I'm sorry. The term is famine that was going on because of there was a rot that had affected the potatoes in Ireland. And so a lot of people were leaving Ireland and coming to the United States. And then they were often being conscripted into the military. The Northerners had a draft, and they were able to bring people into the military. It created a lot of chaos. But eventually, the Northerners were able to prevail, and they won the war. Which brings us to the 13th Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that was ratified in 1865 that abolished slavery throughout the United States. And so basically, this is bringing us back to Juneteenth. Because, as I said before, the Southerners were not really open to just allowing African Americans who, well, actually, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, Africans became African Americans, and the Southerners were really not open to, supporting their freedom. So the military had to get involved, and that brings us back to the whole Juneteenth situation. But the Freedmen's Bureau needed the support of the military all the way around, which is why when after Lincoln was assassinated, President Johnson not Lyndon Johnson, Andrew Johnson was the president back then, basically had more sympathies towards the southern states. That whole situation with 40 acres and a mule was about Sherman trying to give land and a mule to people in the South, and the government basically, the administration repealing that and saying, no, you can't do
And
that.
it never worked anyway, right?
Well, no, they did receive land and a
The
mule. They
individuals actually received the 40
yeah,
acres and the
yeah,
mule. Weren't there
yeah.
stipulations on some of that,
Well, no,
especially property?
what I'm saying is he did it. The federal government said, no, you can't do it.
Okay.
So they gave it back to the people. So that's what ended up happening. And then the other part of it that was problematic was the Northerners, or the Congress, the U.S. Congress, was trying to work with Johnson. He became more sympathetic to the Southern folks. And so the Northerners implemented what was known as radical Reconstruction. And they were sending the military into different regions to work with the Freedmen's Bureau's administrators and the Reconstruction administrators to basically facilitate the process of getting African American men the right to vote. So they were able to vote. And that is a completely different discussion. But there were African American senators, members of the House of Representatives. At one point in South Carolina, their Congress, their state legislature was so mixed, integrated, that they actually desegregated the University of South Carolina. And Richard Greener, who was an African American who had attended Harvard, went down and he worked as the librarian at the University of South Carolina, and he was also taught some classes as well. But that is how monumental the Reconstruction amendments were. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship. The 15th Amendment defined, or basically set up, the vote for African men. But then radical Reconstruction ended. And people were kind of left to their own devices. And that's another discussion as well. But I want to talk about the significance of African American history. And there's one thing that I always hear people say to me, and that is no one ever taught them anything.
Yeah.
And I would say that's pretty accurate. But people can't teach it if there aren't professors who know it. Does that make sense? So if you don't have professors who know ethnic studies or African American studies specifically, then there's no one to teach it. And so when I was in graduate school, even though most of my professors were focused on Europe, I made my research and my papers about African American or even African history as well. When I did my history degree, I didn't wait for someone to teach it to me. I found it. I created it. I constructed it for myself. And that's what people have to do. You're not necessarily going to, you can't watch a lot of YouTube videos and just get the answers that you need, but YouTube videos are very helpful at sort of supplementing your knowledge. You just need to make sure that you're using a legitimate source. For example, Henry Louis Gates has a video series which is based on Many Rivers to Cross, which is a documentary that he had on PBS. PBS has, good. Yes, that's it is. Very good. And so you can find Henry Louis Gates. I'm surprised. I will see people who are making a video about dancing and they'll have 1 million views. And then Henry Louis Gates will have a video about Juneteenth that has maybe 60,000 views. And it's always shocking to me because I always hear people to say, I want to learn more about African American history. Well, Henry Louis Gates is doing it. And there are other people doing it as well. You just want to make sure that the person that you're getting your information or the organization that you're getting your information from is a legitimate organization. I use PBS a lot. I use Henry Louis Gates a lot in my classroom. I use Southern Poverty Law Center has some education things that they're doing as well. So you just want to be very careful when you click on that link. Click on the name of the person providing the information, and then do a deeper dive into their credentials so that you know that that is someone who actually knows what they're talking about, and they're not just pulling information from mythology, because there's a lot of that. So as I said before, you can't wait to learn about African American history. There may not be anyone in your school who teaches it. I learned it myself from teaching. I was already teaching history, and I was teaching diversity studies, multicultural studies. And so over the years, I was reading books, and that is how I learned more about African American history. Museums, number one, I have several places that you can also, if anyone wants to make a note of this, museums are a great source of information. However, I should say that museums also need our financial support if we want them to tell our stories. So you have to visit the museums, and you also need to join as a member. And you also want to provide financial support when they're doing their fundraising efforts. So it's important. They can't exist. Museums are nonprofit organizations. And if it's an African American museum, they need African Americans to support.
They need the monies.
And there are some magnificent museums. My husband and am I okay for time?
You're
okay.
fine.
So my husband and I, when we did our trip to the Underground Railroad, we stopped in Detroit, and we did some Underground Railroad stuff there. But we went to the Wright Museum there. Oh, the most magnificent museum I have ever seen in my life. My next museum is in Chicago. When we go to Chicago, I want to visit the museum there. There's one in Atlanta. There's one in Richmond. Let's see where else. Seems like
and these museums specialize in Black history and Black culture.
Yeah, the African American history and culture. Yes. And there's actually an if you just Google National Association of African American Museums, I think you could find a pretty decent list of people who either have a specific focus on African American history or have specialized exhibits that deal with African American history that you would find useful. So musicians, as I said, museums are great, but you have to support them. YouTube has numerous videos. I've mentioned that. These channels also need your support. So if you were to go to Henry Louis Gates or PBS and you're looking at their videos, subscribe, because they need subscribers in order to get monetized so that they can continue. The third is, I want to say, as the field of African American studies grows, there are numerous books that are being produced by academics. So African American studies. Now, I was just talking to a friend of mine about ASALA, which was founded by Carter G. Woodson, who is one of my personal heroes. And these folks created African American journals, or actually it was a Negro journal. Carter G. Woodson, was responsible for creating Black History Week, or Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. So ASALA is his organization, but those organizations need your subscriptions as well. You can become a member. Any sort of African American history, Black Heritage Society, they need people to become members. It's right here in Washington State. They're having an event on Saturday, as a matter of fact. They need the support of the people in the community to join, and not only to join, but to support through works and also to support financially as well. So as I said, as the field of African American studies grows, there are numerous books out there being produced by academics. I could send you, if you have a website, I can send you a bibliography.
Yes, if you send it to me, we can post it up on Facebook, up onto my page, and people can get it from there.
I also want to say that there are also other fields such as history and political science that have faculty producing books. So you're not just looking at people who teach African American studies, but people who teach history, psychology, philosophy. I mean, there are people out there. And then listeners, if you're looking for some place to visit if you happen to be in the New York area. You can go to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And that's an amazing, I use their online resources. And basically, Arturo Schomburg was from Puerto Rico, but he settled in New York. I think he settled in Harlem. And he began collecting content, artifacts, books, documents on African Americans. And when he finished his collection, he actually gave it to New York Public Library, and that's how the Schomburg Center was created. But they have grown beyond that. I mean, it's one of my goals to actually do a trip to New York eventually to visit the Schomburg and do some research there. And then listeners can sign up for college and university courses. Sometimes you can audit a course. If you don't want to take a course for class, you can, for credit, you can audit a course. Coursera, who has an African-American course by James Anderson, who is a professor of University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign at one point, and then he was like an administrator there. I think he might be emeritus at this point, but he has a free course there if people are interested. There are plenty of certificate programs around the country as well, which usually they're graduate certificate programs, so there's a little, less work involved in terms of the non-interesting courses. You just take the courses specifically in African American studies. And also I suggest that people visit historic sites. In Washington State, there are historic sites. Of course, there's the museum here, the Northwest African American Museum, that needs support and memberships. And then James and Janie Washington Foundation, which is in Madison Valley. That's a place that's a historic site. He was an artist. He was a sculptor, and then he also was a member of the NAACP. And you can visit, if you're in DC area, there's a Carter G. Woodson House, there's a Frederick Douglass House, Mary McLeod Bethune House. These are all national park sites. There's another place in Richmond that we did not get to visit, but it was the African-American banker, and I can't recall her name. And then you can actually go to the national parks and look up their African-American sites and also their Underground Railroad information there as well. Okay. And that is the end of my content for you. I hope that's exactly what you were looking for.
Well, I tell you, it was a lot. I had a couple of questions as you were teaching, but I didn't want to interrupt you. But even as you were talking about the North and the South and the difference, and I was just amazed with New York and Vermont and those states, and you were talking about the agriculture in one, and how the economic situation when slavery was ending and people had started migrating, and I was thinking some of that economic balance or imbalance still holds true to many of our states now. And secondly, I wanted to say how the Great Migration, where did that pin within all of this?
Well, there were the exodusters. They're not part of the Great Migration. You're welcome. They were not part of the Great Migration, but the exodusters were trying to get out of the South. And so basically they went to the Midwest, to Kansas and the Missouri area. The Great Migration paralleled what was going on with the war. World War occurred. World War I occurred, and they needed people to work in, the factories. And so there's interesting, Ronald Takaki has written a book called A Different Mirror. And he has a lot of sections in there about African Americans. I think there's two particular sections that I think readers would find very useful. The entire book is amazing. I use it in my classes all the time. And, but, he was basically talking about how people were the descendants, maybe second generation away from slavery. They just did not want to live under the regime of the South. And they began to migrate north, because when they moved to the north, they were able to have, a working wage. They could work somewhere and they'd have a weekly wage, unlike farming where, you have pestilence, you have droughts, you have, floods and so on and so forth. There was more stability given to them in the North. Once again, in the 1940s, during World War II, a lot of people began to move as well. There was another great migration as well. Seattle really reaped the benefits. You can see a lot of the African Americans who came to Seattle, a lot of the families that came to Seattle, our family came before them, but a lot of the families who came to Seattle came in the 40s. They were looking to create a better life for their children. And so, but that's another story. That's a lot, but it's another story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
We just happened to migrate here during the 60s after the Watts riot.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
there is a reason why people move around, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the reason was to create a better life for our
Right.
family because
Mhm.
Watts was not going to be it. You know,
Yeah.
Los
Yeah.
Angeles was not going to be it. The
Right.
other
Right.
thing
It
that
was a
that
disappointment for a lot of people. I think
yeah,
a lot of people. I'm always surprised when I meet folks whose families immigrated to California, and I never hear positive stories about those early days. It was a disappointment for a lot of people.
yeah,
I think that if now I won't say that living was easier here. I mean, one of the things that we learned. There's a book. Quintard Taylor was a professor at the University of Washington, and one of his book is called "Forging of a Community." And one of the things I want to say about that particular book is he talks about how African Americans, when they first came here, they were smaller in population. They were able to move about a little bit more freely. But as they began to move in larger numbers, there were more restrictions put on them. And even those who were highly educated, like Alice Ball, she actually moved to Hawaii. But Manima Wilson, for example, was educated. And she couldn't. Susie Revels Caton was, I think she was from Alcorn. Her father was Hiram Rebels, and she gets here. She's living a pretty comfortable life with her husband, who owned a newspaper. You know, but after he died, she could not work using her education. So a lot of African Americans, despite the fact that they may have been educated, there was really not a lot to do with your education, and men who had skills through apprenticeships were not able to work in their fields, in the trades either. There was just a lot of discrimination,
right,
and
right.
the jobs paid a livable wage, and the jobs allowed people to have stability, but not necessarily the type of lives they would have desired if there were no restrictions on
Yeah.
them. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah,
I
the
mean,
word.
I think you've been around for a minute, so you know what I'm talking
Oh yeah,
about.
you get enough just to survive on, but
Right,
never really
right.
fully live. You know, if you
Or
understand
the
what I'm
freedom
saying.
to pursue your dreams. And that's one of the reasons why Harlem was so popular with so many people, because it did allow a lot of people to pursue their dreams once they were able to deal with the fact that they were fed and they had a roof over their shoulder. So you had
Yeah,
the artists, and you had the writers and the musicians who emerged during that period. That's a really interesting thing as well. I would say anything you want to know about African American history is on the internet. There's a
yeah,
lot of people who make it their business to build websites, to build YouTube channels which specialize. As I said, the PBS has plenty of documentary series that they've created. I would start there and then sort of branch out and, go to Amazon or wherever your favorite bookseller is. I buy a lot of my books used, so I just put in a title and buy books used from some of the used sellers online, and just read.
yeah.
And if you don't like to read, just contact Seattle Public Library and see if they have an audiobook. That's another way to do it. I
Yeah,
can't see what that says. Oh,
this,
CD Valley, some Mount Baker, and South End.
yeah.
Hmm.
That's when you were talking about the different areas, finding
Oh.
out information. Well, one of
Hmm.
the ways that, and I totally agree with you because PBS, oh my gosh, during the month of February, they really pour out on Black history, a lot of things, and Fannie Lou Hammer, different people
Yeah.
that maybe that some of the forgotten names, and each month, like Mexican Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month. I want to be culturally correct here, but they'll do series on that, and so you're getting Asian, Pacific Asian America. They do all those series, and so there's no excuse for us to be totally ignorant.
No,
anymore.
and you know what? I'm going to
They're
tell you
really
something. You don't have to wait for those months. Just go to their website.
Go,
and you'll
yeah,
find
read up on it.
yeah. And actually, no, the website, you can find those documentaries on their website.
Yes.
I'm a member, so I do pay it, like an annual thing, but I think you can still get them for free, or at least clips from them.
Right.
And also they have supporting materials. They have teacher guides. They have all kinds of stuff out there. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do this summer is sort of to expand on my website to be able to include more content for people. So it's kind of in limbo right now, but I hope to expand on my website this summer to be able to provide more resources in terms of people, being able to look up sites to go to, look up information. I want to create a forum for people to look for information about freedom seekers, and their families and so forth. So, but I work during the year like everybody else. So my summer's a little bit lighter load, so I should be able to get some things going. And I'll let you know when I get it so you can share it with your listeners as well. But I have another appointment I've got to get to, so I'm going to have to go.
We appreciate your time. We just, let me get my clapper back on. We just really, really appreciate your time and you taking out the time to be with us. Really out the time to be with us. And I know that you're a busy person, but I'm so grateful that the time, the day, the timing,
it worked out.
Everything worked out. You were able to get on. It just worked out. And so we are forever grateful to you, Dr. Phillips. And we'd love to have you back again. We'd love to have you back again. So thank you for your time. Beloved people of God, listen, you have a great weekend. Enjoy your weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. I'll see you on Tuesday. Take care. And there's another thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Sister Juanita. God bless you.